So thank you everyone for coming in today. My name is Tom Snyder. I'm Director of Programming and Conservation Action for the Seneca Park Zoo. And today is the second iteration of our Wednesday Wildlife Wanderings. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Marissa Krouse and BJ Kirschhoffer from Polar Bears International, a great partner of ours through Seneca Park Zoo. So I'll start with Marissa. Please introduce yourself and let us know what you do for Polar Bears International, and we'll get going.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tom. And thanks for joining us and giving us the opportunity to chat with you guys today. I am the program manager for Polar Bears International, and that means that I get the pleasure of working with our Arctic Ambassador Center partners through most of my job. And so I work with zoos and aquariums like the Seneca Park Zoo on research, education, and action programs that address the key issues polar bears face in a warming Arctic. And I work remotely from my home in Columbus, Ohio, and also during COVID.
I was going to say it's a very good thing. It's a reoccurring theme with a lot of our field projects that we work with. Is everyone goes, yeah, it's business as normal for us. We're used to doing this distance meeting thing. So great. BJ, please introduce yourself. Let us know what you do for Polar Bears International.
Sure. So, yeah, my name is BJ Kirschhoffer, and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. I'm working from my home in Bozeman, Montana. This is where our office is normally, although, of course, I'm kind of in a closet right now. So typically, most of the year I spend either working on education programs with Marissa, doing a lot of outreach, much like this, or in the field actually implementing some of our projects like we'll be chatting about today.
Great. Yeah. And so we've got a couple topics today. Marissa, you're going to start by talking about some of the history of PBI and your relationship with the zoo and the importance of zoos in polar bear conservation. And just to give everybody a reminder that we do have Inoki at the zoo. And even though we aren't open right now, she's receiving great care. And we really look forward to all of our attendees and all of our friends around Rochester to come in and see Inoki when we get going. So with those couple images out of the way, Marissa, I will give you the comm, and you can go ahead and share your screen and get into your presentation if you want to. And one more reminder for everybody, if you do have a question, feel free to enter it into the question and answer session by clicking the button. I will compile those, and then at the end of both Marissa and BJ's talk, we will go through and have a few minutes of questions. So thanks. Go ahead, Marissa.
Great. Thanks. Can you hear me okay, Tom?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, great. So like Tom mentioned, we're Polar Bears International, and we are the only conservation organization solely dedicated to wild polar bears. But we do recognize that zoos and aquariums play an important role in that. And so we're happy to work with a wide network of zoos and aquariums across the US, Canada, and Europe. We work to inspire people to care about the Arctic, but also to care about its connection to our global climate. As you can see here from our slide, we're a rather small team with about 15 staff members full-time, and then we bring in people seasonally based on our programming. We're spread out across the US and Canada, and we do have a staff scientist currently working in Denmark as well. And so whether we're supporting a polar bear population count in Russia, or researching moms and cubs at den sites, or working with Arctic communities to reduce tensions with polar bears, our team stays pretty busy. And we all have our hands in lots of different pots because we are a small team. So we're all pitching in and helping out with conducting and supporting research, connecting wild polar bear researchers with animal care staff and researchers at zoos and aquariums. And we spend quite a bit of time on executing our education programming that reaches typically over 500,000 students and classrooms. And we work really closely with our partner explore.org to broadcast polar bears across the globe, typically into homes and classrooms every year. And that brings me to the big part of my job is working with our Arctic Ambassador Center network. And Seneca Park Zoo is a part of that network and the Zoo Society. And these zoos and aquariums, it's a network of about 50 institutions across the US, Canada, and Europe. And these zoos, like the Seneca Park Zoo, are helping to direct policy. They're setting research mandates regarding polar bears and helping us to expand our outreach and build collaborative partnerships, all while providing, as you know, the best care for the polar bears and other animals that they have in their collection. And we really believe at PBI in bringing partners together for direct conservation applications. And so we really strive to bring our community of Arctic Ambassador Center institutions together. And by working together, we believe that that furthers, individual work of staff at institutions, but also helps institutions accomplish some of their conservation goals, and then also collaborative conservation goals that we have together with each institution. And I would be remiss if I did not speak about some of the fabulous team members at the Seneca Park Zoo. Tom, you see up there on the screen. But we have been working with the Seneca Park Zoo for over a decade. And you'll see two staff members here, Randy and Kelly. These two staff members, Kelly in the blue hat, Kelly Ulrich is an education staff member, and Randy Krieger on the right is an animal care staff member. And they participated with us last year in what's called the Climate Alliance program. And that's a program solely offered to our Arctic Ambassador Center partners. It's a 9-month program where we get to know each other online, and we build community, and we build literacy in polar bear natural history and climate science. We learn how to effectively communicate about climate change in a way that is collective and productive and civic-minded. And then we also work to build that institutional capacity that I mentioned previously. And so these two staff members had the privilege of working with other Arctic Ambassador Centers in the Climate Alliance program. And then after working collectively for 9 months, we all got the opportunity to travel to Churchill, Manitoba together, the polar bear capital of the world. And this is where we get to have a shared experience in nature. We get to continue to build community. And really, I think, have kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that sort of catapults folks to go home and work with the rest of their institution on their conservation goals. Let's see here. So, not only are we working and staying in the community, but we're viewing bears, but we also get to see, I thought I would include a picture of the Northern Lights that we saw on that trip last year, because it was a special moment that we all shared from the Northern Lights viewing deck atop the Tundra Buggy Lodge with Frontiers North Adventures. But one of the other, I think really impactful moments that we have in this trip together is that, the staff that we work with at zoos and aquariums get to see polar bears every day, whether they're caring for them or whether they're working with their communities to connect their communities to wildlife and to care about wild places. But so these zoo staff members get to see polar bears every day, but to look a wild polar bear in the eye for the first time is a really impactful experience, and really serves as a launching off point, like I said before, to go home and affect change in their communities. And so this bear right here is one of the first bears that Kelly and Randy saw in the wild from the Tundra Buggy Lodge, or from one of the Tundra Buggies rather. And then, as you can see kind of in the left here, this is our group in one of the Tundra Buggies that we spend days wildlife viewing and learning from experts and expert facilitators and community members, our Parks Canada staff. So once our team members come home, like I said, they get to work with their institution on their conservation goals. And we have had the pleasure of getting to work with Tom and his team at the Seneca Park Zoo and Zoo Society to support research projects in the wild. And one of the campaigns that we've worked with the Zoo and Zoo Society on is the Defend the Ice campaign with your Rochester Amherst team. And in previous years, the Zoo Society and the zoo has chosen to support conflict work, and where we provide people who live, work, and play in the North the tools that they need to stay safe in polar bear country. But from the funds in 2019, or 2020 rather, you have chosen to support important research monitoring maternal dens in Svalbard. And so I chose to include this picture because I got the pleasure of dropping the puck with your team, and it was an experience I'll remember forever. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to BJ, because while I've been speaking about teams and people here, I'm going to lose you once he starts talking about adorable mums and cubs in Norway. Here we go. BJ.
Here we go. Thanks, Marissa. And thanks, Tom. So, let's start the slideshow. How about that? Right. So, again, thanks for your support for this project. This is pretty neat work where we are documenting a rarely seen event here in the life cycle of polar bears. I mean, polar bears are hard to study as it is, but actually watching maternity dens is something that very few people get to do, and we'll get a little peek at that here in just a minute. I've been with PBI since 2007. I joke that I'm not a biologist, but I get to play one on TV. I do the technology side of things, so I help implement and test technology in the field that goes for both research as well as helping to prevent human polar bear conflicts, things like that. So, but before we dive into the moms and cubs stuff, let's just do a quick review of where polar bears are and kind of where we're studying. This is a top-down view showing all of the subpopulations of polar bears. Most importantly, though, we can see that, if you can see my mouse, yeah, Alaska here is the US side of polar bears, Canada, where 2/3 of the polar bears live, Denmark and Greenland here, Barents Sea population, this is Svalbard, it's governed by Norway, and then Russia is the 5th place where polar bears live around the Arctic. I don't think we'll dive too much into the trends, but that just gives you kind of a refresher on where polar bears are. The project itself, like I said, is here in Svalbard. This is a large archipelago north of Norway and Sweden there, and has, I think it's about 3,000 polar bears there. Interestingly, polar bears have a massive home range. They have the ability to walk and walk each year. But Svalbard and potentially places in Greenland, they've got some bears that don't go anywhere. If there's food sources in some of these smaller fjords, there's a few bears that actually stay put each year and don't go very far at all. They just kind of eat the resident seals there. So interesting. This whole project, though, looking at maternal dens started over here on the North Slope of Alaska with the USGS. We'll get into that in a second, but let's quick look. Polar bears about this time of year. Let's see if my pointer works. So we're here April, May. This is the breeding season for polar bears. They're out on the sea ice, eating seals, and males and females are getting together and breeding. So as we march along through this calendar, polar bears have something called delayed implantation. If the female's body is healthy enough, towards the end of fall there, she will go into a den. And in southern Canada, this could be a peat moss den that she digs or maybe reuses from a previous polar bear den. In places in Alaska, it could be a snowbank that's on the backside of a small bump on the landscape, something as small as 6 feet. But in Svalbard, it could be, the top of a mountain. It is totally spectacular. So there's lots of different strategies throughout the Arctic. Once she has her den, somewhere in January, she gives birth to a 1-pound cub. If you can imagine a 400-pound female giving birth to a 1-pound cub. This is why the maternity den is so important. This is really kind of an extension of the womb, if you think about it. That cub is too small to survive the cold conditions of the Arctic, and really needs to stay inside of that den with mom, drinking that 32% milk fat that she's producing to grow up to be about 20 pounds, where they can exit the den in March and April, somewhere around there. And that's where we come in. So yes, about that time, we are setting up cameras in front of polar bear dens to watch when they come out to see what happens. This project didn't start with cameras, though. This started with people camping on the ice. So there was an opportunity back in the early 2000s where they knew where some polar bears were denning north of Alaska. And Steve Amstrup, Tom Smith, Jeff York said, hey, let's look at those polar bears. And so they set up, as you can see, that's a tent, and that's a snow blind. And they sat with, I think you can see maybe these are spotting scopes sticking out of the tent, and they watched the polar bear. Now, what they learned is polar bears like watching people who watch polar bears. And they also learned that it's very, very cold on the north slope of Alaska in February. I mean, this place can be 40 degrees below zero quite easily. So I saw another picture from this same series where there was a guy melting butter on top of cookies on the heater inside of that tent just to try to stay warm. I think they were pretty cold. So what do you do about that? You employ technology, and later on, they decided, well, we'll just put a security camera inside of a cooler, and we'll hit the record button and we'll leave. So this is where I come in. I help kind of develop this system in the early days to record the polar bears. Now, there's a lot of advantages to using cameras over human observers. Of course, these systems can be deployed in these really cold remote locations. They can collect data autonomously for long periods of time, probably much longer than most people want to be outside. Cameras, once they're deployed, they don't add any observer effects. So, you know, there isn't this kind of effect of having people there, that people watching polar bears watching people thing. And makes data collection a lot easier and safer for us people. So in 2015, we got an opportunity to move this project from Alaska to Svalbard. And again, this is what you guys are helping to support. This is where we're going at the Norwegian Polar Institute, as well as the San Diego Zoo for boots on the ground support. We didn't just go there for the view, of course, although it is quite pretty. This place, the Norwegian Polar Institute, is very active in putting out radio collars on polar bears. And this is what makes the project tick. Because if you're trying to find a polar bear den in a landscape that looks like this, it is next to impossible. So we use radio collared females, and we take the list of about 20 of them and pare it down to 4 or 5, whatever, to see which ones maybe we can actually get to. Svalbard is quite large. Most of the time we have to take a helicopter to the location. Sometimes we can snowmobile. And then the last kilometer or two, we make with skis and sleds, towing the gear into place to make sure that we aren't disturbing the females in the dens. So one of the neat things about this project is we've been able to push technology forward. You know, I showed you earlier that we used large security cameras with a bunch of batteries, all kinds of stuff. Well, we are now at the place where we are developing our own software for Raspberry Pi computers. If you know what those are, if you don't, it's a single board computer that costs $55 for the most expensive one online. This is a big, you know, transition from security cameras that cost several $1,000s. So we've got a $55 computer stuck with a lens on it inside of a plastic case, and the whole system is dropped from, I don't know, something like 200 or 300 pounds down to what you're looking at here. We're pushing the buttons on Raspberry Pi here. You know, the whole system weighs like 30 pounds or something like that. It's very, very energy efficient, which is what we need in order to make sure the system works in springtime in Svalbard, because it is this time of transition where the daylight's coming back. Like I said, we typically helicopter out, or we snowmobile, and then we ski the last little bit. So you know, why exactly are we out there? So we could look at activity data from Svalbard and compare it back to Alaska. For perspective, we can look at emergence dates, departure dates, and compare that to other places in the Arctic, as well as you know, historic record for Svalbard to see if there's a change with climate change. We can also calibrate the sensors within the collars. So these, like I mentioned earlier, the polar bears are wearing collars. These have accelerometers built in, but we don't have a great deal of information of what those accelerometers are doing. If you own a Fitbit or your cell phone, your cell phone kind of figures out what you're doing. It knows how many steps you've taken a day, whatever, Fitbit knows if you're running, walking, whatever. It doesn't actually know what you're doing. Instead, they studied what the accelerometer picks up, and they were able to correlate that back to an activity. So we're basically doing the same thing for polar bears. We can take the video that we record at the den site and then pair that with the collar data and see what polar bears are doing. Are they rolling? Are they walking, running, nursing, whatever it may be? Also, what's interesting is we get the first glimpse of how many bears exit the den. And since this is mark recapture work with the collars will be retrieved eventually. These bears will probably be recaptured. We can see how many cubs survive into the first and second years of life, right from the day that they leave the den. This is also good for conservation as well. We can help guide resource managers with the information we get. Recorded content can be used to create education materials, which we'll show you here in just a minute. Stuff is pretty cute, and potentially someday maybe we could live stream stuff from the dens, which is also, I think, would be a great opportunity to teach people about polar bears. So enough yapping here. Let's just watch some polar bears. Hopefully that's coming through okay. This is some stuff that we gathered in Alaska. So this is data. It's also quite cute. So it's pretty fun stuff. Typically the bears do leave the cameras alone. This was one exception. Mom came and froze up our lens for us. I think she huffs on the glass here in a minute. So that's Alaska, and then this is what Svalbard looks like. I think it'll play. This is sped up, but anyways, there we go. That's it for me.
Great, thank you very much. Let me go back and thank you very much, BJ and Marissa. We've got a few minutes left. Looks like we have 5 minutes left. So we did have a couple of questions come in. A couple generalized questions on polar bears. Are they good swimmers? Which is a relatively easy question to answer, but I'll let either of you do that. And then the other question that we have is, how do humans affect polar bears, both good and bad?
Well, I'll take a stab at some of those. So, it's a good question if you ask if humans affect polar bears good and bad. And I will say that the single biggest threat to polar bear populations is climate change and human-induced warming. And so while I would say they present an interesting conservation challenge, we can't build a fence around the polar bear's melting habitat. We can't assign wildlife officers at the gate like you might somewhere else. The key to saving sea ice for polar bears is really getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I will say that that's where I think the good news comes in, is because as humans and as a global society, we're so innovative, right? And we're seeing now more than ever that we can be physically distant but still socially connected. And we're seeing now that when pushed, we can change systems on a faster rate than we previously thought was possible. And I think as a community, we all have a desire to keep our friends and our families and our neighbors and traditions safe and intact. And so I'm confident that we will have a positive impact on polar bears by reducing the carbon emissions needed to get the climate back to functioning the way it should.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So we've got, here's a natural history. Any relation to grizzly bears for polar bears?
They're actually really closely related. That's a great question. We had a chat yesterday with a biologist who studies polar bears, actually our Norwegian colleague, Jon Arsh, and he argued for a second that maybe even polar bears would be considered a subspecies of grizzly bears because of how closely related they are. They're so closely related that they can have offspring, viable offspring, if they mate together. So it was something between 200 and 800,000 years ago that they broke off from grizzly bears, which is relatively recent as far as the time period goes.
and I think as we get better at studying genetics, you know, we find out that some of those things that we thought were maybe not connected so much, or thought that we're connected so much, we're seeing that as the data comes in, we might have been wrong about a lot of that stuff.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions that we got as well is they heard that one of our bears, or the Anoki, was artificially inseminated. So that's another spot that zoos are really important for conservation care and understanding, you know, some of that conservation science and reproductive science. Do you have any knowledge on how many zoos are working on that? And the answer is yes, we did attempt that with ours, and we'll continue to attempt that with Anoki.
You know, that's a really great question, and I don't have a solid answer for you of how many institutions are working in the reproductive science area. I do know that, and I'm sure that you worked with Crew, the Cincinnati's Crew, for the artificial insemination. And what I will say, the knowledge that I do have is I know that we have, you know, in the captive community, have poised ourselves really well to be able to look at prioritizing some of these questions, like reproductive physiology, and other priority areas that will help us close key knowledge gaps in polar bear ecology. And those folks that you work with at Crew for artificial insemination are also some of the key advisors and co-facilitators of the Polar Bear Research Council, which, if folks are interested in learning more about some of the key priority research areas or that reproductive physiology, you're welcome to contact me or work with the zoo, and we can help put you in contact with some of those experts, you know, that are just brilliant in the zoo world that know how to address some of these questions. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
No, that actually leads a quick hopefully quick follow-up question. Is there aren't very many polar bears in zoos in the U.S. And I know that may not be your wheelhouse talking about that portion of it, but do you have any insight into why that is, or not so much?
Well, you know, I'll give you a stat. For example, there was one successful birth and mom-reared cub in North America last year in zoos, right? And so I think there's lots of factors that I don't have the science on, but I think they're a relatively low reproductive rate, and they're not going to breed every year. And then when you present challenges of not being in a natural environment, perhaps, like, what can we do to help facilitate that reproduction and birth and rearing of the cub by moms? Because there's also ethics involved with, do we hand rear a cub? So
right.
I think there's lots of challenges, and I think that's probably we should do another connection and bring
there you go. We can do that.
Research Council brilliance in on it.
There you go. So one final question. It's actually a great segue. Are there any ways for science ed people to volunteer with PBI from a distance? Or get involved somehow?
You know, there's lots of ways to get involved, and while we don't have a formal volunteer program for science educators, or, you know, we get contacted a lot about how can we work with polar bears, what can we do to get involved, and I would say one of the best ways to get involved is to visit our website. You're also welcome to contact me, Marissa at pbears.org. And, you know, we do rely on our network of Arctic Ambassador Centers, advisors, animal care, education, technology. So, you know, I think sometimes it's the right place at the right time. And otherwise, I would say visit our website, contact me, check out some of our programming. We do our Tender Connection series every Tuesday and Thursday, streaming live from our homes now across the globe.
Well, you're actually doing a webinar tonight as well that I just signed up for a little bit ago. So,
yes. We'll be happy to see you on there.
Actually, let me see if I can copy that, and I'll put it into chat for everybody. So I will do that right now. This is the link to the webinar tonight.
Yeah, uh-oh. You might have. No, that's okay.
Was I not supposed to do that? We got a bunch of people now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. We'll see. You know, I mean, we're working with these limited tools on Zoom, and there's a cap, and we'll work with what we have.
Perfect. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so great. You know, BJ, Marissa, thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate the time and appreciate all the work that you're doing in a very rough area of the world with some really important animals. So thank you. And from everybody at the zoo, we're tremendously happy to be partners with you and look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you.
Thanks for having us on, and thanks for your support.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for your support. And I want to say thanks again for you working with your communities. I do think that now more than ever, zoos and aquariums are so important when we, need to be physically distant but socially connected. And also, I do think it's going to be one of the places that we can still find, as things open up, a sense of normalcy and a way to connect while still being physically apart.
Exactly. And if I screwed up your webinar, you can use ours. We have 1,000 people in ours. So. Thank you again, everybody. And thank you to all the attendees coming in. We have not verified next week's yet, but we will be doing it again next week, Wednesday at 12:15 p.m. Eastern. So thank you, everybody. And again, thank you, Marissa, and thank you, BJ, for coming. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.